Let's go ahead and get started. Real quick, for anyone who needs it, a visual description. I am a white woman in my early 50s. I've got kind of shoulder length, reddish brown hair, wearing a really casual teal dress with some glasses that are just a little lighter shade of teal. And behind me are some bookshelves, painted teal. Guess what my favorite color is, y'all? Lots of books and some chairs, a lot of stuff going on back there, a couple of plants. All right, I'm glad to see we've got a copywriter here. Nice. Learning experience designer, instructional designer, learning architect, corporate trainer. Okay. Lots of folks here. Good, good. So this presentation, it's like an introduction to a course that I'm launching next month in June. And that one is a more comprehensive writing course. If you're interested in that, I'll share some information at the very end. But let's go ahead and get started. I did post the link in the chat to the handout and slides, but just in case you joined after, I'll post that again. So you will have access to the slides as a PDF as well as a handout that has some resources, references for you. Okay. Oh, first, I want to explain this inclusive LXD logo. If you know me from Scissortail, you might be wondering what the heck that is. That is another part of my company that I am kind of soft launching. I'm launching bit by bit as I get it ready. It's a part of the business that is focusing on helping learning and development professionals learn more about being inclusive and designing inclusive learning experiences, LXD, learning experience design. That website, inclusivelxd.com, is where the inclusive learning pledge that I wrote lives. And if you haven't heard of that, haven't seen that before, I encourage you to go there and read it and sign it if that resonates with you. All right, moving on. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to focus on these questions. What makes writing effective? That's really the gist of the whole thing. How can we overcome the forgetting curve through our writing? How can we make content more digestible for learners, especially when we get that really complex kind of wordy stuff from subject matter experts? How can we declutter that dense and wordy language and make the meaning clear? And how can we tap into the brain's reward system to keep learners wanting more? I love learning about how the brain works. And so I'm going to share a little bit about what I've learned with you later on. First, let's start with this quote from kind of an unlikely source, I guess, if we're talking about writing. But George Clooney said, "It's possible for me to make a bad movie out of a good script, but I can't make a good movie from a bad script." So how does that apply to learning experience design and instructional writing? It's possible to create bad learning experiences from good scripts, right? We can take a good script and somehow muck it up, but we need a good script in order to make a good learning experience. What do I mean by script? It can be anything from an actual script, like if you're creating a video. It could from that to a storyboard. Yes, exactly, Brody, a storyboard, a facilitator guide. Anything that we're using as the basis for designing that experience, whether we're teaching a course, we're making e-learning, we're writing a book chapter, whatever it is, we start with something that's written down. That needs to be as good as we can make it for the learning experience to be effective. So let's talk about what makes instructional writing effective. I want to hear from you in the chat. Fill in this blank. For instructional writing to be effective, it should be what? Give me some words. Clear. Yeah, absolutely. Relevant. Awesome. Learner focused, compelling, clear, concise. Got concise again. Yes. Plain language, actionable, reviewable. Interesting. Yeah. Relatable. Some great words there. Yeah. Accessible. Love that, Zayday. Good to see you here. Relevant. Focused on objectives without rabbit trails. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about those rabbit trails later. Easy to understand by the audience. Engaging. Absolutely. So I came up with a little punny acronym that we're going to use to delve into each of these because I love punny acronyms. But first, before we get to that, let's talk about the forgetting curve a little bit. Oh, Mary Rose says not jargony. Yes, absolutely. So let's talk about the forgetting curve. And give me a thumbs up or a green check mark if you know about the forgetting curve. If this is new to you, you haven't heard of it, or it's been a long time, give me a red X. Okay, I see a green check mark, thumbs up, got a red X. Okay, thank you. So just a brief summary of what the forgetting curve is. It's something that was proposed way back in 1885 by Hermann Ebbinghaus, and it's actually been replicated over the years a few times, and that's what this graphic is from. It's from a study that was done in 2015. So in a nutshell, the forgetting curve just says that as soon as we learn something, especially in a formal learning event, once we learn it, we start forgetting it right away. And after only an hour, we forget about half of what we learned. And that is 0.0 or 0.1 on the chart. The 0.01 is 20 minutes, and then it goes 1 hour, 1 day, 10 days. And the chart, the little line goes to 100, but the data stops at 75 because that's how they compared. And so after a day, we forget about 75%, and it just declines from there if we're not practicing it. So that can be a little disheartening for those of us who spend our lives trying to help people learn. We create these learning experiences, and then we, just to think, oh my gosh, they're going to forget 70% of this by tomorrow. Ouch. Yeah. So how dare they forget? Yeah. That's a hard little pill to swallow. So what can we do about that? What's the general advice for overcoming the forgetting curve? Those of you who are familiar with this concept. Anybody? I'll do the Ferris Bueller. Anyone? Yeah. Follow-up opportunities, spaced repetition. Yes, absolutely. Good. Repetition, spaced actions right away. Yeah, we have to call the information back into our minds. That is how we're going to remember it. Simply the act of recalling the information, being asked to remember it, puts it back into our short-term memory for a little bit, and then that practice is going to help us remember it over the long term. So it doesn't exactly flatten the forgetting curve, but it makes more peaks and valleys, I guess, is once we recall it, that curve that's going down goes back up, and then it'll go back down again because we're going to forget, and then we ask to recall it again and it goes back up. So the more we practice it, the more we're asked to remember it, the more likely we're going to be to remember it. But how do we apply that to writing? What does that have to do with instructional writing? What can we do in our writing to make sure people are remembering? Keywords, nice. Repeat key points. Good. Yeah. Spelling out acronyms instead of just presenting them. Summaries, great one. Yes. Yeah. So summaries, reflection questions, reviews, those sorts of things are going to help make it stick. Yeah. Remember when we talked about this? Yeah. Examples. Using plain language. Yeah, that speaks to clarity. So we're going to talk about that. We can also make the information more memorable through the writing itself, just like Sabrina said, using plain language. Saide said using simple language. Those sorts of things, using real life examples, Brody mentioned, those sorts of things help make it more memorable to begin with. And that's really what we're going to talk about today, is how to use those strategies to activate different parts of the brain and make learning stick. So before we get into that, let's talk about how memory works. You're probably familiar with like 3 parts of memory. We've got the sensory memory, which takes in whatever we're experiencing through our senses. You're taking in what you see on the slides. You're taking in what you hear through my voice, but you're also taking in the other things you see behind me, the things you see in your environment around you, the things that you hear in your environment around you, the feeling of your body against a chair or wherever you are. Those sorts of things are in our sensory memory, and our brain decides what to pay attention to and puts those things into the short-term memory. And it's really choosy, because if we pay attention to every single thing around us, we quickly become overwhelmed. The short-term memory is where the brain stores information for a little while. Some things I read said it's only about 30 seconds. Working memory, you will often see that instead of short-term memory. From my understanding, working memory is a part of short-term memory, and it's where we're storing information that we're actively working with at that moment. And again, whatever we're not paying attention to, we may forget. We have to forget some things, really. What we pay attention to, the brain decides, is this important? It decides to encode it into long-term memory. And long-term memory is really incredible because it's vast. It is capable of storing things really indefinitely. Now, that doesn't mean that we do store things indefinitely there. We could lose it after a half hour, if we're not really paying attention to it, we're not remembering it, recalling it. For memories to stay longer, the brain has to form connections or use existing connections, our neural pathways in our brain. And that is kind of the brain's organization system. The brain is really, really highly organized and efficient. It likes everything in its place, and so it's going to look for a place to put new information. And as long as those neural pathways are being used regularly, if they're not broken in some way, like through a brain injury or something, then the information should stay, and it can stay indefinitely. And the way that we make sure that it does is through that rehearsal loop that you see on the slide, is just bringing it into our short-term memory and practicing it. I think of neural pathways a lot like the paths through the woods I grew up in down in southeastern Oklahoma. I used to go exploring in the woods all the time. It is where I feel most at home, really. And the way that those paths in the woods get formed in the first place is there's some sort of motivation. There's something at the other end of the path that someone wants to get to. And down in southeastern Oklahoma, that someone is usually deer. And they form those paths by running back and forth, by walking back and forth, usually to a source of water or something, maybe food. And that motivation is also what helps us make connections in the brain. If something seems valuable to us, we'll make a place for it in our brain. So we'll talk more about that later. But the other thing is, if the path gets used all the time, it's going to be well-worn. It's going to be easy to walk. But if we stop using it, it's going to become overgrown, really unusable. It might not even look like there was ever a path there. And the brain is very much like that. If we're not using it, the brain is going to weed out those pathways, get rid of them. So how do we help learners form those pathways to help them store information in their long-term memory? We're going to use those characteristics of effective writing that you just mentioned to make our writing more memorable and make it stick in our long-term memory. So here's my punny little acronym that I came up with because I am nothing if not cheesy. I'm going to share tips with you to make your writing so good it should be a crime. So the acronym is CRIME, CRIME. And I love that side A, neurons that fire together, wire together. Interesting. So our C is for clear. And a lot of you mentioned clear, you mentioned concise, easy to understand, all of that. We're going to spend most of our time today talking about clarity because that is the thing that really matters the most. The R is for relevant. It needs to be usable, applicable, meaningful. Some of you said relevant. We're going to be criminals at the end of this webinar. The I is for informative. People have to be able to learn something from it if it's instructional writing, right? It has to be educational, useful, helpful, insightful, all of those things. The M is for motivational. So this is important. Remember that motivation is a big part of why we remember something. We are motivated to stick it in our long-term memory. So you might think inspirational or persuasive. Those sorts of things go along with motivational. And then the E at the end is for engaging. It needs to engage us. It needs to be interesting or fun. Now, it doesn't always have to be fun, but fun is not necessarily the same thing as engaging. We can be highly interested in something that is not fun at all. The chat, you're cracking me up. Okay, so let's talk about how to make writing clear. Like I said, this is the most important thing because if someone can't understand what you write, they're not going to learn from it, right? That is, I don't know, just the gold standard in instructional writing is clarity. There is so much more I could share about writing clearly, and I can't fit it into a 1 hour session. So that is why the course I'm offering, that's starting at the end of June, it's going to delve into all of these topics in more detail and give folks a chance to really practice and apply the things and get better and get feedback, because that's really important. So the first thing to do to make your content more clear is to organize it. And there are lots of different types of organization. There are just 6 listed here on the slide that I'll talk about briefly. But chronological or sequential is, used for steps in a process or something that has to be done in order. Order of importance. We tend to remember things more easily when they're at the beginning or at the end. Those are just the areas that our brain focuses more attention on, and we kind of forget things in the middle. So putting the most important thing at the beginning is a really helpful way to help people remember it, especially when you summarize it at the end. General to specific is another organization method. We were all taught to do this when writing essays. You start with an overview and then you get into the specifics. And we do this in our lessons as well when we do a lesson overview, and then we get into the specifics. So you can actually blend some of these methods as well. Another way is compare and contrast. That's a really useful tool for helping learners understand the difference between related concepts. Cause and effect is like, if this, then that. That's useful for things like reports that show how or why something happened. I use that in like pilot summary reports, things like that. Problem and solution is really effective for troubleshooting guides, user manuals. It's also a really effective way of organizing your portfolio. Those of you who are instructional designers or other folks who need a portfolio, you discuss the problem that the client approached you with and then how you solved it. By the way, I'm doing a portfolio workshop next month as well. There's a link on the handout that I gave you. Mayer's principles. Give me a green check mark or a thumbs up if you are familiar with Mayer's principles, or a red X if you're not. Mayer's principles of multimedia learning. You can learn about them in this wonderful book, Multimedia Learning by Richard Mayer. You can also Google these principles. They're all over the internet to find out more. Okay, I see a yes, a no. Okay, good. Well, we're going to talk about a few of them today, but it's basically just some principles that he came up with to say people learn better when you do this, when you're using multimedia. And so his contiguity principles basically say we should keep words and pictures close together and present words and pictures at the same time. It's why there are pictures in this presentation and I'm talking at the same time. It's that sort of thing. Yeah, Kathy says principles based on research. Definitely. And that's where if you get the book, it delves more into the research and also the application behind these principles. But basically the contiguity principles, in short, is keep your stuff together. So we shouldn't be doing things like see the diagram on page 92, and then people have to flip back and forth to make sense of something. Or refer to the instructions in your manual to complete this worksheet. Why not just put the instructions on the worksheet? I've seen things like this. And then here's one that I know I've been guilty of, and I bet a lot of you who create e-learning are guilty of, and it is putting feedback in a pop-up layer that covers the question and covers, how they answered. The reason we're guilty of that is because it's kind of the default layout in Storyline, right? And in some other tools. And if we can think of better ways to organize our content so we keep related things together, it's going to be better for the learner. So we need to try to avoid doing these things if we can. Another principle to keep things clear is to keep it simple. Sweetie, you may know that acronym a little differently, but I like to be kind. And that means using simple words, simple phrases, using short sentences and paragraphs, plain language, like you all mentioned at the beginning, keeping the subject and verb as close together as possible. That is a really important one for keeping your message clear. That's not what Mayer meant in his contiguity principles, but I'm just going to wrap that into Holt's keep your shit together principles. Just everything needs to be as close together as possible if it's related. So let's look at an example of writing that's not simple. This is like an HR manual. In the event that an employee requests a transfer, the supervisor, at his or her sole discretion and upon written notice to the HR director, must approve or deny by entering a notice of approval or denial into the system within 14 days of receipt the transfer request. Here's a hint. If you read your sentence out loud and you have to take a breath in the middle, it's too long. This one is much too long. What are the other problems here besides it being too long? Heavy language. Yeah, it's not using simple plain language, right? Too many actions in a single sentence. Yeah. In the event that, yeah, that's wordy. It's not clear what someone should do right up front. It's confusing. Yes, absolutely. So one of the reasons this one is confusing is that your subject and verb and the object, which are the essential parts of a sentence, are too far apart. Somebody tell me what the subject of this sentence is. The supervisor. Yeah, that's the one that's doing the action. Yeah, and what is the action? What is the main action of this sentence? There's a lot. That's one of the problems you pointed out. Do you know what the verb, the main verb in this sentence is? Approve or deny the request. Absolutely. Yes, yes. So here's our subject. Here's our verb, must approve or deny. And in this case, we also have an object, must approve or deny what? Transfer request. Absolutely. So those are the three essential parts of a sentence. Actually, object is not necessarily, because not every sentence has one, but the subject and verb, those are essential. And the closer we can keep those together, the more clear our writing is going to be. So how can we simplify this to make it clearer? What are some recommendations? You don't have to like retype it, revise it, but just some general recommendations. Bulleted list, bullet points. Yeah. Yeah. Now, people make fun of PowerPoint because bullets, and they say, you know, the bullets are deadly, whatever. But bulleted lists actually help us make sense of the information at a glance. A graphic could help. Yeah. Put the subject, verb, approve or deny up front. Yeah. Put the words in yellow in one sentence, add other words after as support in multiple sentences. Yeah, that could work really well. Here's what I did to modify that one. You all have some wonderful ideas for fixing that. Here's my revision using bullets. So now we have, if an employee asks for a transfer, the supervisor must, and then we have 3 bullets, decide whether to approve or deny it. Enter it in the system within 14 days. Notify the HR director in writing. So boom, boom, boom. We know exactly what we have to do. And if we wanted to make this even clearer, we could speak directly to the supervisor. Instead of saying the supervisor must, we just say, if an employee asks you for a transfer, then ... decide, enter, notify. So here it's a lot clearer what the supervisor is supposed to do. And we also got rid of that wordy phrase, in the event that someone pointed out, and replaced it with if. So any of those phrases, in the event that, due to the fact that, some of the ones I find myself removing from my own writing are, it's important to note that, just strike it. Keep in mind that, all of those things, you know, we could take those out. We don't really need those. Or we could maybe simplify them and substitute something else. So we also need to check the readability score. Now, this is a screenshot from Word that gives you the readability statistics. When you do a spelling and grammar check, your editor will give you these statistics. And this gives you the statistics for the before sample. So we want to look down toward the bottom, and it tells you the Flesch reading ease is 18.8. The Flesch reading ease score calculates how easy the text is to read. And there's a formula that considers the number of words per sentence and all the number of syllables per word, all that stuff. And higher scores from 60 to 100 are easier to read. Now, what I tend to pay attention to the most is the Flesch-Kincaid grade level score. And that one translates the reading ease score to a US grade level. Now, if you are outside of the US, this might not make as much sense to you, but in general, 12th grade is, you know, that's the top of our secondary school. And then after that is university. And levels of ninth grade and below are considered easier to read. And we really want to aim for eighth grade and below, probably. Even if your audience are doctors or someone else who's really highly educated, nobody wants to read really dense, wordy stuff. We want stuff that's easy to understand and that we can get the information quickly. Even doctors who spend their time reading peer-reviewed journals with really dense language don't want to read that stuff all the time. And when they have an e-learning course, they want something that's a little easier to get through. And it's not dumbing down the information, it's just making it more accessible and for all of us, easier to grasp. So in that first example that we had, our Flesch-Kincaid grade level score is 22.5. Now remember, 12th grade, that's top of secondary school. And university goes up to like level 15. So 22.5 is way beyond that. That is high. That is not going to be easy to understand for anyone. So when we revised it with the bullet points, that grade level score went down to 6.9. So sixth grade level, those are 11 and 12-year-olds. A lot easier to understand. Yes. SMEs, insist on using medical language in our trainings. Yeah. And, if your audience is using a lot of jargon and it's comfortable for them, that is the thing that you really have to understand is language that's comfortable for your learners. If that language is part of their everyday speech, then it's probably okay. And your reading grade level score is going to go up a little bit. But if it is not comfortable for the learners, if it's only for the subject matter experts, then that is something where we have to just consult with them and use our expertise to convince them that this is not what our learners need. So this one is from Microsoft Word, but there are other tools you can use if you're not really using Word all the time. There are some online tools. FX Tools Readability Test and Pre-Post SEO Readability Checker were two that I tested that I really liked how they presented the results. Now, they don't align exactly with what Microsoft Word gives you, but they're very close. I checked on some other ones that you can find online, and I didn't really like how they presented the results as well. So these two I felt were pretty clear and easy to use. Those links are on your handout. Another way we can make writing clear is to not feed zombies. And in other words, avoid the passive voice. This comes from a tip that Dr. Rebecca Johnson tweeted way back in 2012. And she said, she taught her students how to identify the passive voice by saying, can you insert by zombies after the verb and it still makes sense? If so, that is passive voice. So we'll share some example sentences so you can see this in action. The secret recipe for Krabby Patties was hidden by zombies. That's passive voice. The giant marshmallow man was defeated by zombies. Again, passive voice. The One Ring was thrown into Mount Doom by zombies. Passive voice. The DeLorean was driven back to the future by zombies. And yes, I'm a giant nerd. That's what I like these sentences. The Death Star was destroyed by the Rebel Alliance. And if you can substitute by zombies instead of by the Rebel Alliance, it's still passive voice. And actually, when you see by right after the verb, that's a huge clue. That's passive voice. So thank Dr. Rebecca Johnson for that tip, the by zombies thing. Now, what's wrong with the passive voice? Why is it even a problem? Can you tell me? I'd watch that movie where zombies destroy the Death Star. Actually, I'd watch any of these. Zombies do, I don't know. Yeah, the passive voice is hard to understand. And the reason is it's not clear who's doing the action. That's one reason. There are actually a couple of reasons. I remember years ago, there was some scandal and a politician issued an apology where he said, mistakes were made. And I thought, what a cop-out apology that is. Mistakes were made by whom? By zombies? No, you made the mistakes. Own up to it. That's an apology. So it hides whoever's doing the action. You don't know. And the other real problem with it grammatically is that we expect in English words to come in that subject, verb, object order. And the passive voice flips that around so that your verb is coming first and then your subject, if it's there at all. And that makes it more confusing. So how can we make this clearer to make it clear who's doing the action? Well, we put the subject in there. Mr. Krabs hid the secret recipe. The Ghostbusters defeated the giant marshmallow man. Frodo threw the one ring into Mount Doom, and so on.
A gold membership card labeled Nerd Card with Kayleen Holt's name and picture appears and then is stamped with the word revoked.
So we have to say who did the action. Now, passive voice isn't always bad. We can't always avoid it. Sometimes we don't know who the action was, who did the action. Sometimes it's not really important who did the action. The action itself is more important. So there are cases where passive voice is okay. But for the most part, we want to avoid those. And if you notice the readability statistics that Word gives you a percentage of passive voice sentences so that you can help, get that down as close to 0 as possible and get that out of there. How do you factor this in for scripting? We know it'll be translated in other language structures that think differently. I think as long as you're using plain language and you're putting your subject verb, making it as plain and clear as possible, the translation will work out. The problem you'll get with translation is if you're not identifying the subject, then you're going to have some issues maybe in that other language. The other trick to making sure your writing is clear is making it legible. Typography really has a huge effect on not only legibility, but on how people perceive our content and how they judge it. People actually will judge content that's easy to read as being of higher value, of it being more credible. There's a study that was done with scientists where they read half the group got something written kind of like this passage here in a really hard to read font and hard, bad typography. And the other half got a really good article that was, used. Both articles were the same, but the other one used better typography. And the group that got better typography judged the article as being more scientifically sound and more interesting and more credible. So those things are really important. So here we've got a hard to read font. We've got centered text. There's not really white space. When we rewrite the same thing using better font choice, using left alignment and some white space, it makes it easier to read and people are going to judge it as being better content. If you have more than about 3 lines of text, please don't center it. It just makes it harder because the eye has to find that starting place on each line rather than always going back to the same one. Jacqueline asks if there's a recommended percentage of passive voice to stay under. Really, as close to 0 as possible. That's the thing that's going to get it as clear as possible. When you identify the passive voice, ask yourself, can I rewrite this to put the subject first and make it clearer? If it doesn't make it clearer or doesn't make it better to rewrite it, then you might be able to leave it alone on occasion. But for the most part, aim for as close to 0 passive voice as possible. So let's talk about how to make writing relevant. That is the R in our acronym CRIME. The easiest way is to be focused on your audience and your purpose. You have to understand your audience. Who are these learners, these readers? What do they need to know? What do they want to know? Might be different. What could interfere with their understanding? Is there any static that might get in the way? And that could be things like jargon, like you mentioned. It could be things like language barriers. Maybe they have an understanding of a phrase that is a little different than the way you're using it. So we really have to understand our audience well to be able to write for them. And then purpose, obviously, we got to know what the goal is. What are our objectives? What do we want people to do with this information? And we need to shoo away the butterflies. This probably doesn't make a darn bit of sense right now, but Connie Malamed wrote an article called Watch Out for Seductive Details. And she used a butterfly graphic in her article. That article's on your handout. And I thought that was really a perfect image because butterflies are beautiful. They catch your eye. And that's a great metaphor for seductive details, which are those things that are interesting but distracting. So those sorts of things could be things like graphics or video. It could be background music playing in a video. It could be a story that goes off on a tangent. Those rabbit trails somebody mentioned earlier. If it's not directly related to your learning objectives, you probably don't need it. And this is related to Mayer's coherence principle, that people learn better when extraneous material is excluded. Go figure, who would have thought? So try to keep your examples, your all of that stuff to really what's highly relevant. And this also relates to getting rid of those parentheticals, those phrases that don't really add anything to your sentences. Make it usable. Have you ever been frustrated like this person when you're trying to find information and you need to solve a problem or complete a task, but you got to wade through a bunch of unrelated stuff to get to it, or you just can't find what you need? Yeah, as adult learners, we have a problem-centered, a task-oriented approach to learning. And so we need to make the information easy to use. Part of that is making it really readable, organizing it in a way that people can find what they need quickly. In certain cases, maybe we need an index, maybe we need a menu where people can choose what they want to get to. You might have some limitations there depending on your organization, but we need to be thinking about how do we make it usable. We also need to talk directly to our reader. A lot of us were trained out of this back in high school or college when we would get the red marks for using you in a paper, that we weren't allowed to talk directly to our reader. But now we have to unlearn that because we need to be talking directly to our reader. This is Mayer's personalization principle that tells us people learn better when we speak directly to them and we use a conversational tone. That's another thing that's been trained out of a lot of us, is we have to be so formal in our writing. Well, people actually learn better when we're talking to them like they're our friend and we're not so formal. So again, we have to unlearn some of the things that we've been taught. This before example, completion of Form 1082A and supervisory approval prior to filling out or filing the promotion application with I'm sorry, I can't even read it. With HR and entering the action in the system are required for managers requesting to request promotion of employees. Again, wordy. Again, we got to pause and take a break, take a breath. Who's responsible for completing this form? Do we know from this passage? It's hard to tell, isn't it? If we look at the very end, it says managers. Yeah. This example has a grade level score of 19.7. So again, that's beyond a 4-year degree. That's graduate or beyond. So to rewrite this, we're going to talk directly to the reader. We're going to bullet just like we did before. And it makes it so much easier to read. To promote an employee, boom, 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 boom. We've got 4 steps: complete the form, obtain a signature, submit the form, enter the promotion in the system. Yeah, before we had to dig for that information of the managers responsible. In this case, we're going to give this to a manager in their manual or their procedures or whatever, and we're going to talk directly to them. They don't need to know what everybody else's responsibilities are necessarily. They need to know theirs. That example, by the way, was written at a 6th grade reading level, the after. So next, we're going to talk about how to make the writing informative. And the number one thing, and someone mentioned this just a few minutes ago, is managing cognitive load. Cognitive load theory tells us that our brain can only handle so much input at once. So if we think about our memory like this bucket of apples, when we get too much input, too many apples in there, our brain cannot contain it, and those apples are going to spill out. And our brain can only hold so much information at once. Can somebody tell me what that magic number is? Yeah, Jan says 7. It's 7 plus or minus 2, 5 to 9. Yeah. So we get to collect as many as 5 up to 9 apples at a time, 7 plus or minus 2, before they're either going to spill out of our bucket or we need to move them to another bucket, our long-term memory. So what do we do to manage cognitive load? What are some methods we can use? And while you're thinking of that, I'll answer, I think it was Saide's question about the order of those steps. Yes, in my rewrite, I said they needed to do those steps in order. If this is an imaginary company, so maybe they don't, but that's my understanding of it. Chunking, Jan says, yes, we need to chunk content into manageable chunks. There is a reason that phone numbers and social security numbers have dashes in them. It's so that we can memorize a longer string of information by splitting it into those little blocks. What else can we do? Recall. Yeah, we can activate prior knowledge, right? We can help learners connect the information to what they already know so that they're using one of those paths in their brain that's already well worn. And we said chunking the information. Chronological or some other logical order. Yeah, good. I didn't actually put that on my slide, but that is a good note. We can use words and pictures. Saide says use visuals. Yes. Pictures really are worth 1,000 words. They help us learn better and remember more. And when we can combine them with little analogies, like I hope using the bucket of apples analogy helped those of you who maybe weren't familiar with cognitive load theory kind of understand that and remember it. When you're focused on learning a task, make whatever that is as simple as possible so that they're not having to weed through a bunch of other things that are adding to the clutter. And then the other thing is, well, that's exactly what we're just saying, limiting extraneous input. So it could be things in parentheses, it could be related information that's not really necessary. It could be stories that go off on a tangent. It could be things like Mayer's redundancy principle, where if you're having an e-learning course that's narrated, you don't want to put the paragraphs of text that are being narrated up on the screen at the same time. People read faster than we talk. And so you're going to have people reading ahead while they're listening, and usually. But even beyond that, it's a matter of overwhelming one channel of input, our sensory input. We want to use pictures usually, or maybe small bullet points instead of putting sentences on there when they're being narrated. Another way that we can make our information more informative, make sure people learn from it, is to use scaffolding. Give me a thumbs up or a green check mark if you're familiar with scaffolding, or a red X, maybe if you're not. People who come from learning and development, you're going to be familiar with that probably. Also, what about Lee Vygotsky's zone of proximal development? Everybody know about that? It's basically kind of a fancy phrase, awesome, that's defined as that space where between what a learner can do without assistance and what they can do with guidance. And that's kind of the sweet spot for learning, the ZPD. Yeah. And I think of it as teaching a kid to ride a bike. Because when they're first learning, they get training wheels, right? They have those supports, really strong supports. They get those training wheels, they start to feel confident on that bike. And then when we take the training wheels off, they're going to be wobbly again. So we hold on to the back of the bike to keep them steady. And when they think they got it, and they probably tell you, let go, then you can let go and they're riding on their own. And they might fall down. You might have to do it again, give them some supports again. But eventually they're taken off. They're all over the place on that bike. And that's what we do in instructional design. Provide just the right level of supports that the learner needs until they can do a task independently. So the takeaway for instructional writing is that we want to structure the information in such a way that we're providing just the right information at the right level. And we need to provide lots of opportunities for learners to reflect on what they're learning and practice their new skills and get feedback. All right, so the M in crime, how to make writing motivational. You've got to answer the reader's why, the with them, the what's in it for me. Answer it early and don't be afraid to answer it often. But for this to be effective, it has to resonate with the learner's why and not the organization's. You can't just say, this is important because it's our policy. That's not going to motivate anybody. Even if you say this is important because, you're going to get fired if you don't do this. That's slightly motivational. I mean, yeah, okay, I want to keep my job, so I guess I need to pay attention. But what might be more motivational is thinking about, why do you even have the policy in the first place? Is it because 5 years ago, before you had this policy, somebody died because they didn't do this right? That's important. And that story might help motivate your learners. Sometimes companies don't like us telling those stories though, but we have to think about what the reader's why is, the learners. Even people who don't like to read will read something if they're really interested in it. Who else has already binged the first 4 episodes of the current season of Bridgerton? Just me. Penelope's sisters don't read at all. In fact, they make fun of Penelope for reading, right? But as soon as that issue of Lady Whistledown comes in the post, they are grabbing for it and they're fighting each other to read it. Why? Because it's filled with gossip. And that is there with them. That's their what's in it for me. They are interested in that. Now, that doesn't mean I'm encouraging you to put a bunch of gossip in your e-learning, but you do need to think about what learners are motivated by. We also need to tap into the brain's reward circuit. Now, I am not a scientist or a medical professional, so I'm going to talk about this simply from my simple understanding, and I might get things wrong. I encourage you to look this up for yourself. The brain's reward circuit decides what to pay attention to. It takes in input all the time, everything around us, but it decides what's worthy of our attention, and it decides whether the effort to pay attention is worth the reward. And if the decision is yes, the reward circuit releases dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that says, "Ooh, I want more of this." And dopamine, we used to think of it as the pleasure chemical, but it's actually released in anticipation of something pleasurable. If somebody hands you an ice cream cone, your brain is going to release dopamine before you even have a taste of that ice cream because we're anticipating something rewarding. And when the brain releases dopamine, it also signals other chemicals. Did you know that the brain produces opioids naturally and marijuana-like substances? And those substances cause us to feel pleasure. And at the same time, our brain lowers our serotonin level. And that is the chemical responsible for us feeling satiated or satisfied. So with the serotonin level lower and the dopamine level up here, it makes us want more of whatever it is that's causing us pleasure. When my son was little, he told us he had different machines in his stomach. So his vegetable machine was full, but his dessert machine had plenty of room. And we still use that to this day to talk about, oh, I'm so full from that big dinner, but oh, I want some of that cake because my dessert machine is not full. And it's because of that dopamine serotonin relationship. The dopamine is saying, "Ooh, I want more of that because I like it." But the lowered serotonin is also saying, "I got plenty of room because I like that." Yeah, always room for Jello. Yeah. So going on to the next part of the brain's reward system, how does that apply to learning? If we can tap into the brain's reward circuit and create some powerful motivation that can make people want to learn. Think about if you're reading a really good book. As soon as that first line catches our interest, our brain releases dopamine. And the dopamine goes out to the amygdala, which plays a part in memory and emotional responses, as well as decision making. And so that means we're going to remember things that trigger an emotional response. Like if it's a feel-good story, we're going to feel happy. If it's a scary story, we're going to feel afraid, and we remember how it makes us feel because the amygdala is doing both memory and emotion. Dopamine also goes out to the nucleus accumbens, which plays a role in our cognitive processing of motivation and our motor skills. It is what makes us reach out and turn the page. It also goes to the prefrontal cortex, which has a role in attention and planning, our executive functioning. So we decide whether we're going to go to bed early because we have an important meeting in the morning, or we're going to stay up for just one more chapter. Yeah, I have made some bad decisions at 1 a.m. when I'm in a good book. And then dopamine also goes to the hippocampus, which plays a part in forming memories. So that story stays with us long after we close the book. So if we learn to tap into this reward system, we can make our learning experiences more engaging, more impactful, more memorable. So applying the principles that we've talked about throughout this webinar will help you do that. And here are some other ways. The ARCS model. Give me a green check mark if you're familiar with John Keller's ARCS model for motivational design, or Red X if you're not. We're not really going to spend time on this. Just know it stands for attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. What that means is we have to capture our learners' attention and make them curious. So we can have participation, interaction, novelty, humor, thought-provoking questions, some sort of hook, those things. Relevance. We talked about relevance already. We have to meet the learners' needs and help them achieve our goals. Confidence. We have to build our learners' confidence and help them believe they can be successful. So we talked about that a little bit with scaffolding. Another way is building in aha moments, places where they can have that little discovery moment of, oh, that makes sense, that I got that. We have those aha moments, like if someone poses a riddle to you and then you figure out the answer, that's a great aha moment. It rewards your brain and it makes you want more. Even if someone else gives you the answer, you still get that reward because you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Everything clicks into place. And then satisfaction is about helping learners feel a sense of accomplishment and a sense of pleasure in what they're reading or learning about. So that has to do with like rewards and feedback and consequences. We know that consequence-based feedback, where we tell them what happens if they make a certain decision, is more effective than just saying, yes, that's correct, or no, sorry, that's incorrect. And there is a link on your handout for learning more about the ARCS model. So last one, the E, is engaging. How do we make it engaging? We make connections. Making human connections helps the brain make neural connections. They've actually shown that with babies, that, babies who are held versus babies who are neglected they form more neural pathways. And a few things that we can do to make connections with our learning content. We talked about using a conversational tone, Mayer's personalization principle. Using stories, storytelling, that is the way we connect to each other. It is one of the most powerful ways on the planet to teach and learn. Scenarios, case studies, analogies. Combine them with human faces for extra impact. There's actually research that shows when we see a human face, we pay more attention. Use emotion. Emotion is an important part of learning. It triggers the learner's amygdala, that processes emotion and memory. And we remember emotion better. We actually finish processing emotional words more quickly than we process the meaning of neutral words. And there's a really cool approach that I love to use. It's a bookend scenario approach when you can't do full-on scenarios in a course. I don't have time to share it with you now, but there is a link on your handout. If you go to that blog post, I'll share a story about how I use stories with emotion to help people learn better. And there's also a link about the influence of emotion on learning. Facts and feelings are incomplete without their marriage. They resonate as one. That is a quote from Bill Burchard, who wrote a wonderful book called Writing for Impact. It's kind of a copywriting book, but it can apply to anyone. And it is looking at how the brain works and how to tap into the brain's motivation system. So I highly recommend that book. There's a link on your handout. The next tip for motivating and engaging actually a learner is to surprise the learner. Novelty helps us stay engaged. And when we surprise the learner, the hippocampus says, hey, this is different. I want to pay attention to that. And our brain encodes it into our memory better. Surprises release dopamine. And it's why the formula for a really great joke always includes an element of surprise. Humor is a great way to incorporate surprise into our writing. It can backfire if we think it's funny and no one else does. So it's helpful to have some input, some feedback on your writing. Also use this technique mindfully, because novelty for novelty's sake gets old fast. It can also be really distracting. So think about the Goldilocks principle and getting the porridge just right. We need just the right amount of novelty. Yeah, surprise amplifies other emotions. It really does. Be specific. Concrete language and precise word choices are more memorable than kind of bland, neutral words. So if we read a sentence about kicking a ball, the part of our brain that's responsible for moving our leg actually lights up. We create these little simulations in our brain. So it's important to use precise words. Here's some examples. Instead of saying clean the counters, we might say wipe the counters. It gives you that specific imagery. She approached him angrily. Instead of that, she lunged at him. Using really specific verbs is your best bet for creating more memorable language. Rather than adding adverbs and adjectives, use really specific verbs. Ensure the customer is satisfied. Well, instead, we can say delight the customer, because delight is tinged with emotion, and that's going to stick in our brain better. We also want to encourage reflection. This is our last tip. We talked about this already, incorporating lots of opportunities for reflection into our writing, like things like thought-provoking questions, journal prompts, self-assessments, discussions, summaries, all of those things. So we're going to practice this one right now. What is your biggest takeaway from today's session, or just one of your takeaways from today's session? I'll give you a minute, because I know it might take a minute for your thoughts to form. Put that in the chat. We can do the crime. I hope that wasn't too much of a distracting, seductive detail there. Do you remember what crime stands for? Use specific verbs, simplicity, reinforcing storytelling. Good. Don't start writing a sentence and forget to stop for 5 lines. Yeah. Easy to understand and implement. Do not use passive voice. Yeah, awesome. Keep it going. I'm going to share. Here's a takeaway that I hope isn't too discouraging, really. Nathaniel Hawthorne said, easy reading is damn hard writing. I don't want that to be discouraging. If you were made to read The Scarlet Letter in high school, you might not have thought that that was easy reading, but for his time, definitely it was. But basically what this means is it takes effort on our part to make sure the reader doesn't have to put in as much effort. I do want to take questions. I'm so sorry for running right up to the time. I'm here. If you're available, I will stick around longer to answer questions. If you want to learn more, there is a link on your handout to the writing course that I'm doing next month called Smart Writing for Sticky Learning. And that is a 6-week course with 90-minute sessions. So we have lots of time for practice and feedback. It won't just be me talking to you the entire time. There is a link on your handout for more info. So let's go ahead and get questions. You can also email me and connect with me on LinkedIn. For questions, you can put them in the chat, or you could also use the raise hand emoji at the bottom and I can call on you and you can unmute. All right. So I do want to get your feedback. Please go ahead and scan this QR code, or I'm going to post the link into the chat. Thank you for the thank yous. I appreciate it. I do want to answer any questions you may have. So I'm looking for raised hand emojis, or you can plop your question into the chat. All right. Well, if there are no questions, thank you so much. If there are questions, I'm going to stick around for a few minutes just to see, and I will be happy to answer those for you. I appreciate everybody's interaction in the chat. Thank you so much for coming. And I hope you'll sign up for that writing course if you think that will be valuable to you. Thanks so much.